Greetings, citizen. Batwayne is back to join you and keep you protected from villains. And I had so much fun reading, I came back to join you again to read Bunnicula and the Howliday Inn. I think that Bumblebee will be perfect to join us this time. And now that Bumblebee's here, let's jump in. Bunnicula and the Howliday Inn, Chapter 5. She's gone? The next morning, I was startled out of my sleep by the sound of Harrison's voice. "Oh no," he cried. I moved quickly to the front of my bungalow to see what was going on. So did everyone else. Harrison stood in the center of the compound, shaking his head. Ju flew out of the office. "What is it?" she shouted. "What happened?" Harrison pointed at Luis's bungalow. The door was wide open. "She's gone," he proclaimed. Immediately I shifted my gaze to Max. Our eyes met. His jaw fell open as a look of shock and bewilderment swept over him. "But how?" Jill asked. "This has never happened before, has it?" "Not in the 3 summers I've worked here," Harrison replied. Slowly, he surveyed the entire compound, looking at each of us in turn, then suddenly called out, "Look!" We all turned our heads sharply in the direction he was pointing. Unfortunately, I hit my nose on the wall of my bungalow and couldn't see anything except stars. So I took Jill's words to make it clear what it was that had so astonished him. "Oh no," she replied, "the gate! It's open." "How can it be?" Harrison asked. "There's no way the animals could open that lock." "I don't know," said Jill, her brow wrinkled in confusion and distress. "Unless one of us." She stopped speaking then, and a strange expression came over her face. "What is it?" Harrison asked. "What's the matter?" "I did it," she said after a moment. Her voice was soft and a little watery. "What do you mean?" Harrison queried. His eyebrows came close together to form a hedge across his forehead. "I did it," Jill repeated. "I left the gate open. Don't you remember? When I ran to get the towels, I accidentally left the office door locked behind me. So I had to go back by the gate. I was in such a hurry and it was raining so badly. I guess I just didn't notice." Her shoulders slumped, and it was another moment before she spoke again. In the interim, a flash of lightning ripped through the sky, letting us know that the storm was not yet over. "Oh, I feel terrible," Jill went on. "It's my fault. What are we going to do?" Much to my surprise, Harrison came over to Jill and put his arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll find her. It was a mistake. It could have happened to anyone. Come on, let's give everyone breakfast, and then you and I will go looking for her." Jill seemed as surprised as I was at Harrison's concern. She looked at him warily out of the corner of her eyes. "What if we don't find her?" she asked. "Then she'll find us," Harrison said calmly. "She'll wind her way back home sooner or later." He smiled and then said gently, "Okay?" "Okay," Jill replied, accepting Harrison's attempt at reassurance, and together they went back at the office. After breakfast, Chester and I put our heads together to consider Luis's escape. Harrison and Jill had let us out early for exercise, since there was no way of knowing when the storm could start up again. "What did I tell you?" Chester asked me. "I give up," I answered, not all sure what he was referring to. "Didn't I say that there would be trouble?" "What trouble?" I countered. "Luis ran away. Makes sense if you ask me." "Oh, really?" "Sure. Would you care to enlarge on your theory?" "I'd be delighted," I replied. "Luis was very upset about Max's flirting with Georgette." "Agreed." "Agreed. So when she saw the front gate had been open last night, she see the opportunity to run off and teach Max a lesson. She'll be back. That's it. Simple, really. Just open the door to her bungalow and out she went." "Mm-hmm," Chester replied, licking his paws. His long tongue moved slowly between each toes as he reflected on what I'd said. No doubt he was impressed with my powers of deduction. "And did she unlock Max's door too?" "Huh?" I asked, completely thrown. "What do you mean?" "What I mean is that Max's door is open this morning too. You may not have noticed that, but I did. You have to learn to be observant in this business, Harold." "What business is that, Chester?" "The business of crime deduction," Chester answered, neatly snapping his head in my direction to look at me squarely in the eyes. "Crime detection," I responded. I could feel the hairs along the back of my neck rising. Chester has always had the ability to alarm me often unnecessarily. I was hoping this was the case. "Chester," I said, "I think you're getting carried away." "On the contrary," he replied, "it may well have been Luis who was carried away." "Oh," was all I could say, for Max's voice suddenly bellowed throughout Chateau Bow. "It's no good," he groaned, "no good." Chester and I looked out to see him sitting in the middle of the compound, a forlorn expression smeared across his face like a after-breakfast jam. The ever-present Georgette was at his side. "Now, Max, you mustn't carry on so," she said softly. "Hussy," I heard myself utter under my breath. "I can't help it, Georgette," Max cried. His voice cracked. "It's all my fault this happened. I never should have spoken to her the way I did." I could see Taxi moving in Max's direction. Max looked up and saw him coming. "I'm sorry, Max. Taxi started to say. "Not now, Taxi," Max fairly shouted. "But Max, no, Taxi, I want to be alone." Max picked himself up and lumbered back to his bungalow. Georgette followed. He turned to her and suddenly said, "Please, Georgette, I need some space." "Of course," she answered, her feathery voice in the featheriest. "I understand. This is not the time for us." She turned and walked away, her tail trailing behind her like a long shadow on a sultry summer day. Taxi, meanwhile, stood in the center of the compound. From the look on his face, he was not pleased that Max had dismissed him so abruptly. After a moment's deliberation, he moved away towards the warm corner of the compound and began to scratch himself behind the ears. "Come on," Chester said to me. "We've got some exploring to do." "Okay," I answered, "but I don't know what you expect to find." "Anyway, if you're expecting Max of anything, I guess you can rule him out by now. Boy, he is upset. Poor fella." "Is he?" Chester asked pointedly. "Perhaps he is a poor fellow, as you say, or perhaps a poor actor putting on a show." We were walking in the direction of Louisa's bungalow when he bumped into Howard and Heather. They both jumped in surprise. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to startle you." Oh, it's nothing, Howard." "Oh, nothing at all," Howard said. "No, it's nothing at all," said Heather. "Oh my, I'm so jumpy today. I don't feel quite myself. No, I'm sorry about that beastly howling last night, old chap," Howard said to me. He turned and nodded to Chester. "Certainly hope we weren't cause of Louisa's, departure," Heather added. She giggled suddenly, and this just as suddenly she gasped and tried to catch her breath. "What is it?" Howard cried. "Oh, it's nothing," she replied, after letting out a great sigh. "I'm just having such trouble breathing today. I don't know what it is." She looked at Howard, her big eyes wide in bewilderment. The two of them stared at each other in a long moment, their heads bobbing up and down in unison. "I think we'd better," Howard began. "Go home," she finished. "Yes, dear, I think it's best. Do excuse us," he said, turning to us. "I'm not just herself," said Howard, and they turned and left. Chester and I watched them go. "Typical Wolvian behavior," said Chester, his voice full of authority. I'm sure I would have asked him to elaborate if it were not for the fact that I didn't really care in the least what he had to say. So I changed the subject. "Weren't we going to go exploring?" I asked. "Yes," Chester answered, snapping himself out of his pensive mood. "Follow me." I followed Chester to Louisa's bungalow, where we stood for what seemed like a long time staring at the emptiness inside. "Just think," I said, feeling a tear coming to my eye. "Last night she was here. Today, she's gone." "Yes," said Chester slowly. "That's exactly the word. Gone. Escaped," I added. "But soon she'll be back with us." "Nonsense," Chester said sorrowfully. "She didn't escape. She won't be back. No one comes back from murder." "Murder? Of course murder," Chester replied evenly. "It's all falling into place, don't you see?" "What's falling into place?" "The suspect, the motives, and now the evidence," said Chester. I was confused, which around Chester is a normal state of being, so it didn't alarm me. "What evidence?" I asked. "Look for yourself," he said, with a nod toward the bungalow. "What do you see?" I surveyed the interior. "A rug, a water dish, a food dish," I said, "just like mine." "Ah, but it isn't just like yours, Harold. And that's the key." "Why? I don't see anything so different. Look again. And this time, use your powers of observation as they are now. Now what do you see?" I scrunched up my eyes and looked carefully at each square inch of the space as studying for the final exam for an obedience school. "Well," Chester prodded, "a rug, a water dish, a food dish," I proclaimed. Chester sighed and shook his head sadly. "Sometimes I despair, Harold," he uttered. "Allow me to fill you in on what you've missed." "Please do." "The rug. How is it different from yours?" I shrugged. "It's all jumbled up," Chester went on. "A real mess, in fact. In the food dish, almost filled with food. These observations may seem insignificant, but what, my friend? Now we come to the water dish, perhaps the most significant of them all. And yet, isn't it really the water dish, but what lies around it that's so disturbing?" Thoroughly confused, I looked at the water dish and the floor around it. Nothing struck me as unusual. "But don't you see?" Chester asked. "What is lying all around the water dish?" "Water?" I ventured. "Exactly," he exclaimed triumphantly. "Well, what else would you expect around a water dish?" Ordinarily, the appearance of water around a water dish would not be out of ordinary in the least, but given the unusual combination of factors, it is most striking. And it will be even serious considering our investigation. Suddenly, Lyle zoomed by us. "Faster than a speeding bullet," I heard him call out as he passed, "able to leap buildings in a single bound." Chester shook his head. "That Lyle is a disgrace to the species," he said. Then, back on track of the previous thought, he said, Come on, Harold, I need to talk this out with you right now. We found a quiet spot under a tree in a corner of the compound. The storm seemed to have abated for the moment, and I thought how pleasant it would be to lie here for a while and commune with nature. But Chester had other ideas. The rug, the food dish, and the water on the floor all add up to foul play. My dear Harold, don't you see? Signs of a struggle, old boy. Old boy, I thought. My guess, it's only a guess, mind you, is that someone pushed Louisa's head into the water while she was drinking. She resisted, which recounts for the spilled water and the wrinkled rug. And the food, I asked? She never finished her dinner, Chester said. She was, shall we say, interrupted. I must confess, Chester's seductions began to awaken in me the possibility that what he was suspecting was true. Still, it wasn't going to give up my theory of Elise's escape so easily. What if it happened just as Jill and Harrison said, I asked. Isn't that possible? Sure, it's possible, Chester answered, but it's unlikely. Why? If Louise ran away, it's only logical she would have finished eating her dinner first, since she couldn't have known when she'd be eating her next meal. And why the appearance of a struggle? And why, Chester added, was Mac's door open as well? If you're saying Max did it, I'm not saying anything yet. Obviously Max had the motive, but the strength to pull it off? Let us picture the scene. He comes to Lisa's bungalow telling her he wants to apologize. She lets him in. He pushes her head in the water. She struggles, but he has the strength to hold her down. Afterward, he drags her body out through the front gate. But he's so upset today, I said, still not believing Max is capable of such an act. Either that or, as I suggested before, he's pretending he is, to throw us off, you see. I allowed as how I did. What about Georgette? I asked. She could have done it. I wouldn't put much past her. Yes, that's possible. The only problem is that I doubt that she has the strength to hold Louisa's head down. What's more likely is that they are in cahoots, she and Max. She may have been his accomplice, unless, of course, there was... And here Chester thought for a moment, I have the method of the murder itself wrong. That will bear some thinking. In the distance, Lyle dropped from the branch of the tree onto Taxi's head. Taxi, not in the mood to wear Lyle as a hat, shook him off so violently that he landed several feet away. Stunned, he picked himself up and screamed at Taxi, I can tell when I'm not wanted. Don't think I can't take a hint, and he stormed off. What about Lyle? I asked. Do you remember how he threatened Louise yesterday? Indeed I do, Chester answered, nodding slowly. You haven't seen the end of me, he said. Just watch out. And you know, Harold, Lyle is just crazy enough to do it. When you think about it, murderer could be anyone here. Anyone, I puzzled? Anyone, Chester affirmed. We know of the instance that Howard and Heather were part werewolf. You know, I corrected. Oh, come on, Harold. No normal dog howls like that. That's true, I concurred. I don't. True, of course. You're not normal either, but we'll overlook that for the moment. Thank you, I said. Besides, werewolves are very hairy. Look, how hairy Howard and Heather are. Well, they're wire-haired dachshunds. You said so yourself. They're very wired-haired dachshunds. Chester countered, refusing to allow logic to blow his theory. And if they weren't werewolves, they can change shape anytime they want. Huh? I inquired. Werewolves can change into anything, anytime at all, in order to assist them in the pursuit of evil. I tried to imagine Howard and Heather changing shape. It was hard to picture Howard as a clothes hanger or Heather as a toaster oven. I was about to mention this to Chester when he spoke again. You have to admit they were behaving strangely today, he said. Guilt, Harold. They were consumed with guilt. I said, I doubt werewolves feel guilty. The guilt comes from the wired dachshund's part of them. It's common to the breed. Oh, I replied. And what about Harrison and Jill? Do you suspect them too? Of course, said Chester. They're both a little on the shady side if you ask me. Besides, we don't know the whole story on this Dr. Greenbrier yet. If you want my opinion, it's a little more than strange that he's gone off and left us in the care of these two. I wouldn't be all surprised if they're acting on his orders. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Chester answered innocently. I'm just thinking out loud. It's interesting, that's all, that while the doctor's away, Louise disappears, and neither Harrison nor Jill seem too concerned about letting him know. Maybe they want to find Louise first, I suggested. Or maybe Greenbrier has ordered them to murder her. Oh, Chester, I said, this last is too much. What about Jill? Didn't you see how upset she was? Again, like Max, it could be she's faking it. Or, and he paused for a moment, perhaps Harrison is in it alone with the not-so-good doctor. That's a possibility, too. My head was spinning with Chester's theories. Then I thought of one suspect he'd left out. In Taxi, I asked. He's too dumb to concoct a murder like this. I didn't like saying it about poor Taxi, but it's true. You don't have to be a genius to murder, Harold. No, it isn't Taxi's intelligence that troubles me. it's his strength. He's a timid little fellow. I can't imagine him holding Lise down long enough to... Here, Chester drifted off into sudden thought. Suddenly his eyelids lit up. Unless, he then said silently, if we change the method of murder, then yes. We know that Taxi is always buttering up to Max, right? Right, I answered. And we know that his feelings were hurt yesterday when Max went off with Georgette instead of spending time with him. We also know that he'd do anything to please Mac to get back on his good graces. But murder, I asked. I couldn't believe it of Taxi. Sure, why not? I was on the wrong track, don't you see? If we believe that Luis was drowned, then Taxi is pretty much ruled out. He wouldn't have the strength, and I doubt that he'd have the guts. But if the method of murder were less direct, if, for instance, he paused dramatically, Luis were poisoned. I felt a jolt go through me. Chester, I cried, what is it? I remembered something Taxi was saying yesterday. Max had just gotten through telling us about sometimes he thought he'd be better off without women, yes? And Taxi told us about a television program he'd seen where a man feeling the same way murdered his wife. And the method, Harold. What method did he use? Poison. Chester and I sat very still for a moment. My gaze drifted to where I had seen Taxi sitting a few moments before. He was no longer there. Could it be? I asked myself. Could Taxi have murdered Luis to please Max? What kind of warped mind existed in that peculiar little body of his? I turned my head and then, much to my surprise, saw Taxi was sitting a few feet away. He stared at me in such a cold way that I knew he'd heard every word Chester and I had said about him. Taxi? I said, startled. He didn't respond, but continued to glare at me. I swallowed hard and tried to speak again. I'm... Taxi cut me off with a menacing growl, and before I could get another word past my lips, he turned and walked away. He heard, I said then to Chester. Yes, was all Chester said in reply, but there was something in the way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine. Oh wow. Well, Batwade is here to keep all of you safe, as well as you, Bumblebee. What did you like about the story? I like that part too. We'll see you on the next adventure, okay? And we'll see you on the next adventure here with Wayne Reeves. Batwade enjoyed his time reading a story with you, and I can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye.